Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of PNP Live. I'm Lissa Muscatine, co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my husband and co-owner, Brad Graham. And on behalf of our fabulous staff and events team at the store, we welcome you to what is going to be a great event tonight. We're so glad all of you could be here with us. It is truly an honor to have Pete Buttigieg this evening. Tonight, he will be discussing his new book. It's called Trust, America's Best Chance. Mayor Pete, we have very fond memories of hosting you for your first book, Shortest Way Home, last year. That was when you were just launching your presidential campaign and when nobody knew how to pronounce your name. Well, you went on to captivate the nation. Everyone learned to pronounce Buttigieg. And of course, we like to think your PNP event helped catapult you from the mayor's office in South Bend, Indiana, to winner of the Iowa caucuses in February. Campaigning during those months, you provided all of us, all Americans, with a refreshing example of what political discourse can and should look like. And you won even more admiration when you put aside your own presidential ambitions to help the Democratic Party coalesce around Joe Biden in hopes of beating Donald Trump. So thank you for reminding us that there are still at least some people in public life who put the public interest above their own. Mayor Pete's new book is, in his words, and as the title suggests, an examination of the role of trust in America's past and present. Trust, he says, is an essential topic. And one need only have watched the mendacity and verbal contortions emanating from the White House about Trump's medical situation these past few days to appreciate the corrosion of public confidence that occurs when our political leaders prove so untrustworthy. But how do we return to a place of trust between and among citizens, our government, and our institutions? That is the vexing question that Mayor Pete tackles in his new book. Before I turn the floor over, let me just say one other thing about Pete Buttigieg beyond his obvious innate political talent and eloquence. He's a literary fellow, as anybody who has read his first book surely knows. A lifelong student of history and literature, he appreciates that immersive reading and writing leads to deeper thinking and often to a deeper truth. So as a public servant and as a literary man, he really is the perfect person to write a book about trust in the body politic, especially at this terribly precarious moment we find ourselves in. In conversation with Mayor Pete tonight is a dear old friend of mine and former colleague, Michelle Martin. Michelle, it is great to see you on our PNP Live stage. Thank you for being here. Michelle is a familiar voice on NPR, weekend host of All Things Considered, and for many years, the host of Tell Me More, a program she launched on NPR in 2006. Over more than 25 years in journalism, she's worked at the Washington Post, where we first met, the Wall Street Journal, and ABC News. She's been a guest commentator on many, many, many network news programs, and along the way has won an Emmy and a stack of other awards for her reporting. It is such a delight to have both of you with us. We are thinking of this as the world premiere of Mayor Pete's book. It comes out actually tomorrow. So thank you both for being here. The floor is yours. Enjoy the event. We're so happy to have you.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. Mayor Pete, thank you for joining us in conversation. And thank you to our ASL interpreter, Paris, as well. So thanks. I'm so glad everybody is here tonight. And Mayor Pete, I didn't have the opportunity to read your first book. So if you mind, jump in the Wayback Machine with me for a minute and just tell me why you decided to go into public service to begin with.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for the chance to have this conversation. Thanks to Politics and Prose, a real institution and a place that I love visiting every chance I get. And thanks to everybody who's joined us this evening. My journey into public service was kind of roundabout. I grew up in a family that was maybe not politically connected. I don't think I ever met an elected official when I was growing up, but very politically aware. Always watching the news, always talking about what was happening in the world. And it was really when I, maybe a little bit in high school, but really when I got to college and was at a place that was soaked, among other things, in memories of, for example, the legend of President Kennedy and what he had meant to the community at Harvard, that I began to think maybe you don't have to be from a political family to make a difference, and began to envision myself in that way. Mostly interested in national and international politics, only to find that the greatest sense of purpose that I would get in my professional life at least certainly up until the time I ran for president, was to look closer to home, a place that maybe I was running away from a little bit because I grew up in a community like so many in the so-called Rust Belt, where you kind of got the message that success had to do with getting out. And yet the more time I spent away from South Bend, the more I began to feel this kind of tug that then became a draw and eventually became a kind of militant identification with the struggles of my city that led me to want to be a part of shaping that city's story and ultimately becoming mayor and having the privilege of serving during an extraordinary kind of turnaround decade in the life of our city.
Were you torn between sort of, you know, the kind of the idea of the man of action and the man of letters? You know, there are periods in you know, world history where those are not seen as incompatible, but unfortunately in the present moment, some, you know, they, you know, stereotypically sort of are. Were you ever sort of torn between being a writer, as Lissa pointed out, that you obviously love to write?
Totally, yeah.
You sort of torn there, and how did you kind of decide that, or what was sort of the genesis of the idea that one or the other, or maybe I could do both? Like, how did you sort that out for yourself?
Yeah, I think that you know, I viewed writing and certainly art as this kind of really worthy pursuit, but one that was also kind of solitary and a step apart from the world. And then I thought about politics and policy and how much I cared about that and how different it was. And I always felt this kind of tension inside my life between those two instincts. One, to sit down in a quiet room and think and write, and the other to get out there and pound the ground and knock on doors and be part of activism and activity. And I'm not sure I've even now quite reconciled those, other than that I've discovered you can be active in public life and also write. If I were more talented as a writer, I would have become a novelist, but that I still think might be the highest level of all. But you know, found that I could write and tell stories, not just my own story, but the stories of others. Part of maybe the most fun I had in Shortest Way Home was writing a chapter that takes place before I was even born, based on interviews of people describing what South Bend was like in those days. And similarly, when I was writing this book, Trust, really enjoyed kind of digging in and researching a lot of different moments in American life and American history, and trying to bring them all together to this moment we're living in right now, where so much depends on our ability to build up a greater level of trust.
So let's dig into the book. And it's you know, we started, in the spirit of full disclosure, we started our conversation about the book on Saturday, on the Saturday edition of All Things Considered, which I know everyone here studied closely, and I know that everybody heard it, so I don't really need to. But just for the 5 people who may not have had the opportunity to hear it, I just want to sort of start where we started then, which is, how did the idea of trust as kind of a defining issue or cause come to you? Because I think that most of the people listening to our conversation will notice that a lot of people a lot of people feel that there's something wrong with the way America functions at the moment. And and a lot of people have tried to sort of put their finger on what that is. And a lot of people have come up with sort of different analyses of it. Some people say it's, you know, our governance is broken. Some people say it's, you know, income inequality is at such a level that, you know, we're just not functioning as some people just say that, you know, some of these political jobs have outgrown the moment. Okay, so I'm not saying that this is a theory of everything, but I am saying that this is kind of an organizing idea. And I just wonder how it came to you. And did it come to you as an insight all of a sudden, or did it come to you over time?
So I think it gathered over time as I was trying to make sense of some of the biggest crises and patterns going on around us, including the ones you were mentioning. Because the more I thought about them, the more I was able to better understand them through the lens of trust. For example, you look at our political environment, the chaos of it, and how we got here. And part of what's clearly the problem is that we don't seem to have the ability to trust that we even live in the same reality. Many people who support the president have not just a different set of interests or a different set of values, but a different set of facts, or at least what they consider to be facts. And I could feel the effect of that even when I was a candidate in the Democratic primary process. You know, I also experienced in a different way as a candidate the full force of American conspiracy thinking, something that's not confined to the right, but also exists right, left, and everywhere in between. And I saw some of the effects that had. Then, almost no sooner than my campaign ended, the coronavirus epidemic overtook our country. And one of the things I saw was that so much lives depended on people trusting the advice of medical professionals and disease experts, and yet a lot of people didn't trust even the basics of the importance of staying at home, or the value of these closures, or the significance of wearing a mask. In many ways, I think all of this has actually come to a head, though I never would have known this when I was writing the book earlier this year, in the news of this week. Consider, for example, this character who we're all learning a lot about, the president's doctor. Here you have somebody who's connected with three of the most prestigious and important institutions in America. First of all, the medical profession, because he's a doctor. Secondly, the White House, the highest office in the land. And third, the military. He's an officer in the military. Each of these are institutions that should have a level of credibility beyond reproach, and that only function if there's a level of trust in what they have to say. And yet each of those institutions, we've seen it, even leaving aside party politics, we've seen how it's been degraded in this moment. And so, whether we're confronting the most acute challenges of our time with the pandemic, or the awakening around racial justice that's going on in our country right now, or challenges that are coming at us from the future and invading our present, like the emerging role of climate change, the ability to deal with any of them, in my view, really does depend in so many ways on whether we can establish a greater level of trust in our institutions and in each other.
I don't want to get sidetracked and sort of focus just on this issue of the White House doctor, but is that a system problem in his case, or is it a him problem? I mean, the fact is that the White House doctor has been giving conflicting messages. He didn't have to.
Right. Yeah,
so,
there's no question that... There's no question that he's making certain...
Or is it a reflection on his decision to behave in that fashion?
Yeah, there's no question that he's making certain choices and will be responsible for those. But I also think that there would have been a time not long ago when, even with the kind of muddled things that he's saying, all of us would have thought, well, there must be some way that all of this is true, because it's the White House talking, it's a military officer talking, it's a doctor talking. This must make sense. And yet, of course, it doesn't. And I think that reflects the pressures that he's under, but also the warping of our institutions. Yes, because of Donald Trump and who he is and what he's caused, but not only because of that, because a lot of other forces that, in my view, helped make Trump possible just as much as he has accelerated these issues.
So let's talk about where you think this started. How do you think this breakdown of trust started? Trust in institutions, and frankly, this is something else you talk about in the book, trust in each other as people.
Yeah.
How do you think it started?
If you look back at the polling, it's actually for decades, researchers have asked Americans the same set of questions. It's such interesting data that I actually put an appendix in the book of a report that the Pew Research Foundation did. For example, the question, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing most of the time? That's been asked in almost the exact same form for more than 50 years. And if you look at the graph, it is a downward slide from the 3/4 of Americans having that kind of trust half a century ago to less than a quarter now. Now, the classic answer that's given is always Vietnam and Watergate. And as I discuss in the book, that's clearly part of how we started to lose institutions lose confidence in institutions like the presidency, like the military, failures of integrity, like the corruption that Watergate represented, and failures of competence. The fact that the military, which was fresh off winning World War II and looking like it could do absolutely anything, was now mired in this quagmire. But the more I looked at the issue, the more I saw that it wasn't as simple as this issue of Watergate in Vietnam. Many of these patterns in losing trust actually started before that happened, and they accelerated long after you would think we might have gotten that experience out from our system. Consider this, for example. If you look back at Watergate, as dark a moment as that is, you would think that would have been something that reinforced some level of confidence in our constitutional systems. Actually, after all, the most powerful official in the country, the president, was removed from office. In fact, he resigned on his own to preempt the inevitable because Congress, with members of both parties stepping up, were preparing to hold him accountable. It almost seems quaint from today's perspective to see the ways in which the system more or less responded to those misdeeds and worked. But what we've seen is that there's been a deeper corrosion, partly because of our media environment, partly because of our relationship to information, and in my view, partly because there have been deliberate efforts to undermine trust. And I don't just mean things like Russian misinformation, although I discuss that in the book, and we may take that up later in this conversation, but also an ideological project that really began in the Reagan era to systematically break down Americans' belief that government could solve problems. And that wound up having a self-fulfilling quality that I think is haunting us to this day.
But why do you say that, though? I mean, because if you say that that preceded Watergate and preceded Vietnam, then that wouldn't have been a Ronald Reagan problem. It wouldn't have been a modern conservative project. That it seems like that might speak to something else, you know. So what's if it predates that, then what's the root of it? You know, I'll just tell you, just throwing it out there. You know, Robert Putnam famously bowling alone and talked about how atomized we are sort of becoming as a society. You know, he doesn't shy away from the fact that diversity has something to do with it. You know, race does have something to do with it because as you know, and we discussed the fact that, you know, people of color, African Americans, have ample reason not to trust institutions, like just, you know, name the issue, you know, voter suppression, medical experimentation, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But you also point out the way majorities distrusting of minorities inhibit the ability of minorities to flourish because of the way these institutions are constructed based on a lack of trust of these minorities. So some people argue, and in fact, I don't want to attribute this to conservative thinking overall, but I remember in response to Robert Putnam's work around this, some, you know, conservatives argue that this is what happens when you have more diverse environments because people don't know each other enough to trust each other. So there it is. Sorry.
Well, this is, again, a really important concern for our moment. But you're right, it's got roots, obviously, throughout a history that we can trace back 400 years. But in that more recent history we're talking about, there's no question that the confidence a lot of white Americans expressed in government institutions started to fall right around the time of the civil rights era, when those institutions were starting to do a better job, imperfect but better, of accommodating Black Americans and other historically excluded Americans in that kind of social contract as a country. And it's clear that this has been part of the issue. At the same time, I don't think it's automatically the case that diversity flies in the face of trust. It really depends on whether we can build enough overlapping circles of belonging that make it possible for people to view their experience through the lens of others. Unfortunately, our circles right now are not so much overlapping as they are concentric, especially if you look at the media environments. You add to that the fact that, as you said, a lot of certainly African Americans have had every reason to be skeptical, whether it's of a medical establishment that in cases like what happened at Tuskegee was just brutally unethical with direct consequences and fundamentally violent consequences, or a political system that did not meet them in good faith. One of the things I really wrestled with how best to characterize in the book was the extraordinary level of trust shown by figures in the civil rights movement, figures like John Lewis, who was on my mind a lot as I was writing because he passed away right around that time. And there was no sort of naive trust about the goodwill of those institutions that they were marching against. But there was a level of trust, not only in each other, in the solidarity of those who stepped forward, but also in the possibility of those institutions to be reformed or to be remedied, even using their own pulleys and levers. And one of the really remarkable things was that those visualizations that happened of the brutal and violent repression of civil rights marchers compelled a lot of white moderates who were disinclined to trust the accounts that they were hearing of repression, especially in the South from Black voices, to finally trust what they were seeing with their own eyes. And I think in some ways, that's got a remarkably powerful parallel to the way that a lot of well-intentioned white progressives moved from being vaguely sympathetic to being vocally activist in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Again, a case where maybe accounts that weren't always being trusted, even though Black Americans had been offering these accounts the entire time, being corroborated by such grisly footage and cell phone videos changes that field of fact and makes it possible for more Americans to be aware of that same reality. We talk a lot about how social media brings us into bubbles and distorts our access to the truth and facts, and that's certainly true. But at the same time, in maybe more ways than it's gotten credit for, it's made it harder to deny certain realities. And I think the movement for Black Lives is one powerful example of that effect in our time.
I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's like a Pete for America hangout going on in our conversation. Like a lot of your supporters from all over the country are jumping in to participate in this conversation, which is one of the only good things to come out of the fact that we're all stuck in our houses or wherever we're stuck in, is that, you know, more people can participate than would be the case, I think, if this were an event in person. So, you know, shout out to all the Pete people who are jumping in. Good to see you, or sort of see you, or know that you're there. Good to see you're in the chat. And we'll certainly get to your questions later, and I hope we'll have some questions too. I just want to be sure that you see the love, Mayor Pete, that the love is coming in strong. There's this one story that you tell in the book. You tell some really interesting stories in the book, so I hope people will get a chance to read it. But you talk about sort of the need to build concentric circles of trust, and concentric circles, overlapping circles of experience. But I'm still fascinated by this experience that you had in Afghanistan when you were on your way to the airport to pick up another member of the crew, the team who was coming in. And this is a dangerous look. I mean, it was every trip had its opportunity for peril. There was a particular circle that you came to that the Marines called Suicide Circle, and for obvious reasons. And at one point you were approached by another driver, a civilian, you know, an Afghan civilian, right? And he was gesturing to you. Now, you don't speak Pashto, right? And he didn't seem to speak much English, but you had a decision to make in that moment. Like, you had your training, but you also had, you know, you want to go home too. Right. And you know that there had been some other experiences where this is an opportunity for a suicide attack, right? You know, he's pointing to the wheel well. The wheel well, you know, is a place that you can put a device. And so you could have pulled your weapon on him, but you chose not to. And the reason that I think this is so powerful to me, in part, is that this is a situation that law enforcement people face all the time, and civilians face. Let's just say it in encountering law enforcement. I'm just wondering if you can help us understand. Now, you didn't have like overlapping circles of experience in this moment. And I just wonder, like, what is the thing that allowed you to trust that this person wasn't trying to harm you? Is this a gut thing? Is this something that can be taught? Does this come with, can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a moment I think about a lot. It was otherwise routine, a traffic jam in Kabul, which is pretty much what traffic is in Kabul. And I should probably share how the story ends, which is that after asking myself this question, why is this stranger approaching the wheel well of my vehicle? And should I respond by leveling my weapon at him? It turned out to be the case that a piece of his car had actually physically gotten caught in mine, because our cars had kind of mashed up against each other as we were going through an earlier intersection. And he just needed that part of his car back. He removed it from the wheel well, this piece of fiberglass, kind of ducked away sheepishly and put it back on his car and got in and drove away. But there was a moment where his life and mine were very much in play. And the truth is that feels like the right decision because it ended peacefully, but there's a scenario where it could have been the wrong decision, and it would have been the wrong decision not only for me, but for the Marine sitting next to me as well. Part of it was instinct. Part of it might have been good fortune. Part of it was nonverbal cues, just this sense that this guy didn't seem like he was on his way to kill me. And yet in the end, you don't quite know. And this is the thing about trust. Trust is for situations where you can't be sure. Another thing I write about in the book is Ronald Reagan was fond of this saying, trust but verify, which is actually a Russian maxim. It rhymes in Russian. But I also think it reflects a Russian sense of humor, because you literally cannot trust if you're verifying, and verifying is not trusting. It's not a saying, it's a joke. And this was a situation where you couldn't verify and you had to decide whether to trust. Part of why I reflect on that is that these situations do take place, often in war zones, often in encounters between civilians and police officers. And what goes into the decisions people make are things like experience, things like training, but also things like bias. And we need to recognize that trust is another one of those things that has not been given equally in this country.
And of course, this is obviously something that, I think is on the minds of many of us in the current moment. I have a 17-year-old son, and, as you can imagine, as he's gotten older, and isn't like the cute little curly haired boy who likes to pretend to be a lion and sneak up on people, obviously my anxiety level about who will trust him to be a non-threat, and how much do I clip his wings and his development as a young man in order to allow him to live to be an old man, I mean, we all think about this. I mean, we think about like Philando Castile, who was a lawful gun owner, wasn't trusted to be that, and was murdered in front of his girlfriend and her child. And, so I just wonder, I don't want to skip ahead to some of your ideas of solutions and also get to the sort of the questions, but what are it's such a deep stem in this country. What are your thoughts about whether and how such a deep stem can be overcome?
Well, first it has to be named and examined. And racism is clearly the deepest well of distrust that we have in this country. And there's nothing symmetrical about it for the experience of white people and of black people and of other people of color. But what we know is that when we examine it, we can also find ways to do something about it. It starts by naming it. Brian Stevenson eloquently has described the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that just in and of itself becomes a weight that impacts certainly every black man in this country, not only in these deadly situations like police encounters, but in routine situations like walking into a store or around a mall or down a street. That in turn provokes reciprocal reactions that can affect the way every routine bit of your life goes, in addition to these dramatic and sometimes horrific and violent situations that we learn about on the news. Now, it's also clearly got to be the case that there are ways to overcome this. If, for example, the kind of reconciliation and reintegration that's gone on in countries that have come through experiences of genocide, Rwanda comes to mind. If that's possible, it's got to be possible that in America, which has had its own genocidal past, there are ways for us to undertake the kind of process of regard for one another that will be needed in order for this to be stamped out. I think we would be naive to suppose that it's easy, but we would be mistaken to believe we can get much further as a country without it. Because we've clearly taken the American project as far as it can go without confronting these demons that really live in the fabric of American life.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what your prescription is for America for overcoming these trusts. I'm not sure that Rwanda is the example that we want to cite right now, given that this, reconciliation has also come at the price of deep authoritarian impulses on the part of the current president, and a lot of, just steps that just would not be tolerated in the United States, like changing the national language overnight so that you could disenfranchise a whole generation of people or mandating that the parliament be gender equal, which of course the outcome is one that we might applaud and think was appropriate, but that's not something we would tolerate. So tell us, what's your prescription for restoring trust in America?
So there aren't easy answers, but I did find some patterns in ways that people and societies and even countries can cultivate trust in a hurry. Here's the problem. The surest way to establish trust is to do the right thing in a very predictable way for a very long period of time. That's how the most robust and steady forms of trust are developed. Trouble is, we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time within America to come to trust one another. We don't have a lot of time with respect to our institutions to build up the kind of trust in science and medicine that will be needed in order to confront the coronavirus or climate change. And frankly, America doesn't have time to reestablish the credibility that we're going to need in order to survive and be secure on the world stage. So then the question shifts to not just what are the most enduring sources of trust, but how do you get trust at warp speed? And there are some examples of that. One of them that I cite is by analogy to the experience of military service. Not the kind of trust that I formed with people by the end of my tour who I'd served with, and I felt like I really understood their character and I would trust them with my life because I know them so well. But the fact that some of those same people I had to trust with my life the moment I met them. And I think it's worth thinking about those circumstances where we come to trust somebody before that trust can be vindicated, can be corroborated by experience. In some ways, it's true in the interaction that I had with that individual out on the street outside of Masood's circle too. So how do we do that? Well, sometimes that kind of trust arises because you're put in a situation where you need to count on each other. And I think America as a whole is in exactly that kind of situation.
Oh my God, you're not telling us we all have to go out in the woods and fall on each other, do we? Because I'm just not doing that. I'm sorry.
I don't think it'll come to
sorry,
that.
Not doing it. All right.
You could argue that the election itself is a kind of trust exercise.
Interesting.
Okay. It's an exchange of trust between citizens and our leaders. The founders, back when democracy wasn't so fashionable, even their limited version of democracy as they had imagined it, which of course didn't include most Americans, but even that seemed radical. And the question was, how can you possibly trust the people that much? Of course, others were wondering, why should the people trust government that much? And you could view the entire Constitution as an attempt to create a kind of stable balance of trust between the governed and those who govern.
Okay, well, give us some ideas. You said we don't have a lot of time. I think a lot of people would agree with you. So what are some practical steps that people can think about and perhaps even consider implementing or working toward after this conversation?
One, I'm a fan of national service, not mandatory, but creating as many voluntary opportunities for people to serve as possible. The military may not be for everybody, but different opportunities to serve in a climate corps or an expanded version of AmeriCorps create more of those overlapping experiences that create a sense of belonging that makes it possible to build greater trust. Another thing that I think we should look at is structural reforms in our democracy. Again, one of the reasons that we don't have the trust we should in our institutions is that they become, in some ways, less representative over time. Why should a citizen of the District of Columbia trust the federal government when it literally doesn't give them a voice in the US Senate? Just to take one example. And we've fallen out of the habit of constitutional amendments when our country, as I talk about in the book, used to produce a substantive amendment at a pace of roughly once per decade. We haven't really done it in about 50 years. And when you look at gerrymandering, the role of money in politics, the need for a national popular vote, the right of citizens of DC and in Puerto Rico, if they want to be states and have that representation, that I think would go a long way toward our elections having more credibility. These allegations of voter fraud are almost always false, but it is true that our elections have been twisted in a lot of ways by structural problems. So that's the second big category, structural reform. The third, and the most interesting from the perspective of international relations, is rising to deal with an emergency. America got about 100 years worth of trust on the world stage in a matter of about 4 years because of the way America mobilized to confront the threats to democracy during World War II. And by mobilizing so swiftly, the US really earned a level of credibility that would ordinarily take much longer to establish. Now, unfortunately, we've squandered that credibility in our time, but for better or for worse, major world historical crises on par with the crises that confronted the world during World War II are upon us again. To name two very obvious and glaring ones, the pandemic that we're dealing with right now and climate change that we ought to be dealing right now. If the US really were leading the world in responding to it, rather than resenting the rest of the world and shrinking from it, we could be able to quickly recover the credibility that we need so badly. So
it strikes me it's not just it was not just the handling of the crisis, but it was the post-war, the American position in the world post-war that also led to credibility. There was not a grab for territory.
That's right.
The United States didn't go to plant its flag on every available or not available piece of land. What would you say to people, though, who are already kind of winning the unfairness? Like, why should they give up their advantage? I mean, just to be just to be blunt about it. I mean, we see the current, this is something we just discussed on set, it's just the current situation around the Supreme Court justice, like setting the health issues aside. The reality of it is the Republican senators said they were going to take one posture toward filling a vacancy during the last year of the president's term. They have now, a sufficient number have now changed their minds about that fact, and Democrats are furious about that, as you would imagine they would be. How does one, I mean, why, and their attitude is 10 beats 9, deal with it. That's well, really the bottom line, 10 beats 9. So yeah. How do you persuade people that the larger project of restoring trust is worth it when they think they're winning?
I think the most important thing is to point to the ways that nobody wins in the long run if trust keeps being degraded. It's one thing to win the day for your interests or for your values on a fair field. It's another for the field to be so warped that you don't know what world you'll be in 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years from now. And I think that's where we've gotten to. We're not even having the same conversation sometimes. And that's why I always try to penetrate some of these echo chambers and information bubbles. It's one of the reasons why, as a progressive, I make a point of appearing on Fox News, not because I think that all the opinion hosts over there are there in good faith, but because I know some viewers are tuning in good faith, and we got to get to them. And much more than you would think, it's possible to reach people, but only if you're addressing them. But I do think this is also part of why those unsexy but vitally important structural reforms are so needed, because we have a system right now that frankly doesn't do much to reward those who do the right thing or to punish the kind of cynicism that has clearly overtaken the Senate GOP. But it is, I think, a much larger phenomenon that we're seeing rewarded all too often in our political setup.
I still want to hear, like, how do you persuade, say, people in Wyoming that the people of the District of Columbia, who actually outnumber them in population, should have a vote in the Senate when they currently do not? Because this has been presented as a zero-sum game. I mean, Americans have been encouraged in the current environment to think that way, to think that, you know, I get mine, absolutely, you get yours, you know, go get yours, you know.
And the problem, of course, is that everybody winds up worse off in the long run. You know, another thing in my book is a discussion of policies in a place like Scandinavia. Again, very different, partly because there's not the kind of racial diversity that we have in the US, but still very instructive if you look at the ways in which a tax code that was viewed by the public as fair led to the ability to deliver good services, which in turn allowed more and more people to support the kind of tax code that they have. Here we have the opposite. People know that the tax code's not fair, that some people don't pay their fair share, and so they hesitate to support the government doing anything at all. But to answer your Wyoming question, I think another way to think of it is, and frankly, I find this effective when speaking to, for example, extended family members who are in a different place politically, is to just pose the question in a very serious and literal way. What has been taken from you? What do you think is going to be taken from you? And if you unpack that, you can begin to get to territory where we realize that while people have been made to feel that zero-sum energy that you're talking about, we have a chance to all be better off, but we won't all be better off as long as some of us are continually denied even the basics of a chance at prosperity.
Before we turn to the questions, love Wyoming, just letting you know, wasn't a diss, love Wyoming. Would go now if I could.
I bet we have some Wyoming friends on the call now too.
I hope so. I certainly hope so. Okay, well, to that end, and before we turn to the question, so speaking of taxes, should President Trump be prosecuted once he leaves office for tax evasion, if the evidence suggests so?
Well,
speaking of trust, because you're arguing that the argument here is that people don't have confidence in the tax code in part because they think that certain people have advantages that they don't have. Right. If the evidence suggests that that should be the case, should he be prosecuted?
If there's a case, then yes, of course. Now, I actually think that, you know, the last thing that political figures like me should be doing is saying what should or shouldn't happen, because that's a legal process. But if a good faith prosecutor sees a case, then this should be treated like any other case would be. And, you know, this is a really important element of our ability to trust the system, is to trust that it in fact treats all of us equally. There's a sense, a justified sense, that it doesn't, that there are two different systems. And if we don't do something about that, then what you start to see is a breakdown in the legitimacy of law itself. You know, one thing that's been observed, coming back to the subject of policing, is in areas that have had greater struggles with police legitimacy because of things like bias or violence in policing, there winds up being more crime between civilians as well. And the reason is that people are less likely to, for example, if there's unfortunately often the most violent crime is between teenagers. If there's a beef between two groups of teenagers and they, and perhaps even any parents or grandparents involved, just don't believe that the police are legitimate, then they're going to be unlikely to call on them to intervene when there's a cycle of violence going on. And so the cycle will continue and become more and more violent. That's why I think some of these political frames that try to meet concern about police violence by pointing to crime among civilians misses the point, which is that the more legitimate the police are viewed to be, the less their services will actually be needed because the society becomes less violent.
Let's go to some questions from the folks here. Oh, we got a few. We got a bunch. We have a lot, folks. I'll do my best. Wow, there's so many questions and there's so many different subjects. Apologies here. Okay. There's so many questions, folks, that I'm trying to figure out what is the I'm trying to figure out, like, what are the center of gravity here. So let's say let me just jump around to a bunch of different topics, and I'm gonna tell you what the minister told us when my husband and I got married, which is that you should just start out the day by saying I'm sorry. That way you're covered for the rest of the day. So for all the people who sent good questions, and I'm just gonna start it by saying I'm sorry. I'm not gonna get to all of them, and there are a lot of good questions, but here's a question. It says, with the SCOTUS decision not to take on Kim Davis's case, making a statement implying conservative-leaning judges want to revoke marriage equality, how can Democrats work toward court reform? What's the best approach to preserve rights like marriage equality and reproductive rights?
So, I've long been interested in the opportunities for bipartisan court reform that just makes the court a less political body. Like many Americans, and certainly like many gay Americans, I was alarmed when I woke up to the news that Justices Alito and Thomas, in the course of this document indicating the denial of this Kim Davis case, more or less called, not in so many words, but pretty clearly called for the court to revisit or overturn the decision that makes my marriage possible. And, so many Americans in different ways have seen their rights come up for debate. It is a difficult time for the LGBTQ community, knowing that so many of our marriages exist by the grace of one vote on that Supreme Court, and knowing what the agenda of this president is when it comes to this nomination that they're trying to push through. It's one of many reasons why we really need to mobilize around this moment. And of course, I'm with the majority of Americans who believe that the winner of this election should name the next nominee to that seat. But this is also another of those moments where elections have consequences, and we should make sure that the results this fall send a very clear message that this kind of reversal and denial of rights is not okay. And that message has to be sent in a powerful enough way that not only the White House, but the Senate GOP feels it. Because I think it's the only way to reunite them with their conscience. And that means a decisive effort and victory in the fall for those who think that these rights are important and deserve to be preserved. Whether we're talking about marriage rights or choice or any other rights.
I was going to save this for our last question to leave people on this note, but so many people are asking it that I'm just going to ask it now. How do you remain hopeful? A lot of people are on this chat are expressing, well, they're delighted to see you and they're delighted to be connected to each other. Many of them apparently worked on your campaign or volunteered in a number of states, but a lot of people are expressing a lot of despair about the current moment. And I think a lot of people would like to know, how do you remain hopeful, which you seem to be?
Well, part of what I do is I think about the 2020s. And, this year, there's a joke that says, what a long decade this year has been. I mean, it doesn't even feel like the same year that began with the impeachment of the president and included a presidential campaign that my campaign only ended a few months ago, and then went through the murder of George Floyd, the arrival of the coronavirus, just one after another events really punching America in the face in terms of just the way we get up and respond to the news. But here's the thing, 2020 is not over. And the story of this year even has not yet been written. And one of the most important chapters is about to be written. So the first thing that gives me hope is to remember that citizens' moment of maximum power is the moment that's coming up right now. A second thing that gives me a lot of hope is to think about what the 2020s might be like as a decade. I think that there's certainly a very dark path, a possible path, where this becomes the decade that America gets swallowed by the corruption of our institutions, ultimately defeated by forces like white supremacy, and enters into a decline that is probably the most important thing to happen in the 21st century and is bad news for democracy itself. That ghost of Christmas future is out there, but it's also very possible, and if we get this right, probable, that this becomes a decade where the American majority that believes in racial justice, the American majority that believes right now in higher wages and making sure everybody gets health care and LGBTQ equality and choice and more investment in public education and stronger infrastructure and true democracy and all the things we stand for, that majority is actually vindicated and heard. And if that actually happens, the decade we're living in could go down in history as the decade that led to something we've not yet seen on this earth, which is an America that by mid-century would be the first large-scale, multiracial, fully pluralistic, fully democratic, and equal society. Such a thing has never been produced by the human species, not at this kind of scale. In many ways, we have advanced many of those forces in our history, but we've never lived up to it all the way either. If we did, I think it would be an amazing turning point, not just for America, but for humanity. We can live to see that if we get this right through what I like to call the deciding decade that's in front of us.
A couple of questions about, I don't want to lose sight of the media question, because you're not, you don't go lightly on my people in this book about the role that you think the media plays in eroding trust and also could play in restoring trust. And by media, I think you mean writ large. I think you mean both legacy media and as well as social media, correct? So talk a little bit about that. And also I don't want to lose sight of a question that a number of people have asked is, can you think of concrete steps that people can take in their communities to try to restore trust?
Yeah.
So if you would ask the media question, because I think it's important to you, and then I want to not lose sight of the fact that people are looking for concrete things that they can do in addition to voting, which, everybody's on the chat is talking about.
Right. So yeah, the media question I think is huge. And there are a lot of things that have gone on in the media that have eroded trust. Part of it's the rise of ideological media like Fox News and a lot of what goes on there. But part of it actually is the result of kind of both sidism in media, which often can cause two sides to appear equally legitimate. I think this has in particular been a big problem in presenting the facts around climate. But also creates the impression that there are only two sides to an issue, which can also create a lot of mischief. Now, I think media can also hold a big part of the key to how we get this right by creating the kind of spaces where people who disagree on values or represent different interests are still held accountable to the same field of fact. And to the extent that media, and I think we've seen that more in the last couple of years, media organizations represent and recognize their role, that sometimes actually you do need to be the arbiters, maybe not of which ideology should hold sway, but of what the truth is, that really does matter. And it's one of the reasons why we need that editorial function that social media companies are unwilling to play. They always say, hey, we don't want to be responsible for saying what's true, so we're just going to shovel it all out there, and by the way, make a lot of money while we're at it. But journalists are different, and that journalistic function has never mattered more. Actually, because we have access to more information, it's actually because some people thought, as everybody got more information through technology, you wouldn't need journalists as much, right? You don't have to send a reporter into some area because people can send in cell phone video showing you exactly what happened there. Well, we're getting more raw information, but that actually makes that function of sorting through it more important than ever. Just like when I was an intelligence officer in the Navy, I was trained on the difference between information and intelligence. Information is data, pictures, whatever's out there. Intelligence is taking that and turning it into something that can help somebody make a decision. That's the function that we need from media more than ever.
And you support your local NPR station, I hope.
Sure do, absolutely. Dues paying member, and
making,
yeah.
making sure.
Absolutely. I think WVPE is doing their pledge drive right now. So, no, it's
I
so
am
important.
fascinated by this because I must say, and I promise you I'm not whining. I promise you I'm not whining, I'm not complaining. But I can tell you that every time that I understand what you're saying about both sides, and we've had 3 years to talk a lot about that among those of us who are sort of in this work. But I can tell you that even among the audience that we have at NPR, people who I consider to be interested in fact, a fact-based approach to journalism, no matter what, I always get complaints whenever I interview people that people don't agree with. I don't want to hear from that person because I don't like what they're saying. And I'm just, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, obviously, I don't know what to do about that.
Well, that's where I think sometimes salvation does come from the local. This is why your other question, I think, is so important about what we can do in our communities. Communities provide a way to see the humanity in people who might have different commitments in terms of ideology or party. And by community, I'm deliberately a little vague about this, right? One community I'm part of is the community of veterans, and specifically the people who were in the units that I served in. Groups of people who are radically different from me, sometimes politically or generationally or racially. I'm very eager to hear what they have to say because we have this other connection that binds us together. But also communities in the more literal sense. Sometimes it's easier to recognize the human value of somebody who views the world differently than you do when they're your neighbor, because they're a good neighbor, even if you are horrified by some of what they believe as a citizen. But it creates the building blocks for a better kind of dialogue. By community, sometimes I mean community of interests. Our church communities or other communities of faith are just one example. And another thing that's really at stake, I think, in this question of how we associate with each other online or in person is how we can create those kind of patterns of belonging that create not groupthink, but group solidarity. And then the more those groups overlap and are different from each other, the better. Maybe you belong to a Muslim community that I don't, but we're playing on the same soccer team, and we all of our circles wind up overlapping at that little point. We've got to build that up in every area where we can find it. It's a classically American thing to do to begin with. It's actually become more, not less important as we go into this digital age.
Before we let you go, I just have one. Let me just grab one more question for you from the folks. I'll just grab this one. And again, apologies to all the great questions that we didn't get to. I tried to sort of get the kind of the center of gravity of the different groups, if that makes sense. But there's one question that's a specific question about Democrats. It's, Pete, can the liberal Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party and the moderate Biden Buttigieg wing continue to effectively coexist within the same party, or are their attitudes too divergent to continue to work together and compromise?
I think we can. In fact, one of the things that really encourages me just in terms of the politics of this moment, and I know we're not encouraged by much about politics these days, but I watched the Republican convention, and one thing it was missing was a lot of Republicans. It seems like many of the prominent figures from the Bush era, for example, are so horrified by the Trump era that they want nothing to do with it. Contrast that to the Democratic National Convention, where you saw folks like AOC or Bernie, and actually Republicans like John Kasich appearing on the same program, sometimes on the same night, with a lot of folks like Joe Biden or me or others in between. And what that shows is not that we're pretending to agree on everything, but that we're recognizing a common set of values and a common desire for our country to move forward. Now, that takes a certain kind of flavor during election season. It'll be different when, if all goes well, we're actually governing. But I also think that's when it becomes healthier. Frankly, some of our arguments a year ago were, I think, more ferocious because they were kind of academic. We were debating how far to go in a perfect world where we could do anything we wanted. In a few months, if all goes well, Democrats who've been debating what we would do for a long time will be responsible for actually getting stuff done. And I think that will lead to a debate and sometimes a tug of war that is fundamentally accountable to reality, because we'll actually be doing the things that we said we'd be doing. And that'll make it both harder and more productive.
Well, thank you so much for visiting with us. I still want my button. I was explaining that the book is fine, but I want some campaign swag. I was following the campaigns in South Carolina before we got shut down on travel, and my efforts to get a Pete button eluded me. So I expect you to restore trust and make sure I get a button.
We'll see what we can get you.
I think we all.
Thank you so much for conversation.
Thanks so much for doing this.
So thanks to the audience, which, as Michelle was saying, Mayor Pete, if you could see the chat column, there are people tuning into you from all over every corner of the country, which is just a testament to how much hope and belief you've inspired in people, and you continue to. I know we are going to see a lot of you. We hope we're going to see a lot of you in the future. That gives me some comfort, I must say, and I'm sure many, many others. Everybody, here is the book. Michelle just showed it also. Hot off the presses tomorrow. Michelle, you are the interviewer extraordinaire. What a pleasure to have you both. What a great event. I think it could have gone on for hours.
I just want to show everybody my Malta. I know there was some conversation. It was from the summit. I didn't put that there just to score brownie points. That really is in my office. That's from when I was a White House correspondent at the summit.
It's a historic moment.
So
you need to read this book, but you also need to read Mayor Pete's first book, because then you'll hear a little bit more about Malta. So thank you both. Good luck to everybody. Stay well read, and be safe. And thank you so much for coming.
Same here. Real treat. Thank you.